everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Sean Conrad. Travis Liska is here. With the Sustainable Development Team here at NCTCOG. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to our April Land Use and Transportation Planning Task Force. We developed this task force to provide a forum for North Texas local governments to discuss best practices related to coordinating land use and transportation plans, policies, and progress. So we hope you enjoy. As Travis mentioned, we're recording this meeting. The recording will be posted on our website along with the slides after the meeting. If you have any questions at any time, feel free to enter those in the chat box. We'll also have a few minutes after each segment to have some questions. And then we'll have a panel at the end where any other questions or thoughts that you'd like to share. Today's meeting is the second of our 2023 task force meeting. We have 2 more meetings scheduled for 2023, and the schedule is also available on our website. Start today, we'll have a local update from the NCTCOG Environment Development Department regarding their transportation and stormwater infrastructure activities. We'll move into presentations touching our theme today, which is land value capture for transportation funding. Should be really interesting. We have presentations from Celina, North Richland, Hulse, and McKinney. Wrap up with our panel discussion, and we have a number of announcements, including some exciting funding opportunities that may be of interest to you. Next slide. So to start things off, we'll hear from Aaron Blackman from the NCTCOG Environment Development Department. Aaron.
All right. Hello, everyone. Sorry, there's a little bit of feedback.
All right, Aaron, I'm going to put us on mute.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me now? All right. Yeah, so I'm Aaron Blackman. I'm a planner in the Environment and Development Department at COG. I just wanted to take a couple minutes just to notify this group of some upcoming opportunities that I think you all would be interested in. So thank you, Sean, for the opportunity to do that. Both the opportunities I'm going to mention are related to the Integrating Transportation and Stormwater Infrastructure project that we are working on with many other partners, including the Transportation Department. If you're not familiar with the project, it seeks to integrate regional planning for transportation, stormwater management, urban development, and environmental features. The integration is critical to decrease flood risk, minimize overall life cycle costs of infrastructure, and reduce the impacts to the natural environment. So the project area, as you can see on the map on the screen, is defined by the area outlined in green. It includes the northern and western portions of the North Central Texas COG area. This area is expected to grow significantly to 2 million residents in 2045, which is a 126% increase from 2020. And with growth and development comes an increase in pervious surfaces, and all that can have a potential to pose flood risk to those growing communities, as well as impact downstream communities. So we are hosting the next round of sub-area meetings to continue engaging and seeking input from the local stakeholders. So if you're a community and you have an interest in the project area, you're welcome to attend any of these meetings. You can attend the location that is closest to you. All of the meetings will include similar information, so there's no need to attend all 4. But we look forward to getting more input and involvement from a variety of stakeholders so we can deliver some usable project outcomes. All right, next slide, please. And then the other opportunity that's being offered is in coordination with EPA Region 6 and the City of Denton on green asset management. Green assets are natural and engineered assets that replicate the functions of natural systems like green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. So the TSI project includes identifying effective locations for implementing green infrastructure. This meeting, as well as the TSI meetings, can be found by visiting our department's events page, which is linked there. I'll also include a direct link to all of these events in the chat as soon as I finish here. So this green asset management meeting will be a hybrid meeting. We ask that you do register to attend both, particularly the in-person one because space is limited, but it is May 16th at 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And that is it from me.
Okay, thank you so much, Erin, for providing that update, and appreciate that. Hopefully you get some good participation in that project. We're going to move on now into our land value capture funding for transportation, and we are going to start off with patients. So I'm going to pass it over to Travis.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, so hi, everybody. This is Travis Liska, Principal Planner here at the Council of Governments, and I'll be talking about our introducing our panel discussion on using land value capture to help fund transportation. I'm first going to walk through an introduction from the regional perspective. The Council of Governments is working on a regional value capture report. So we're going to show some of that here in the next few slides. But we've also are joined by a selection of planners and staff members from around the region and consultants to discuss what's happening in various jurisdictions in North Texas. So a lot of expertise today. So really looking forward to the conversation. And of course, when we start talking about a topic, we want to define it a little bit. So just to get everybody on the same page of what we mean when we say value capture, we're really talking about the tools that allow local governments to take the value, the investment that is happening from new real estate development, from property value increases, and use that value to then fund public improvements. Obviously, we're focused on the transportation element of public improvements. And you can see here both, or not just both federal agencies, but federal agencies within the Department of Transportation at the federal level are also interested in this topic and have materials out there defining it as well. And so on that note, on my next slide, I get into why is the Council of Governments, why is COG, why are we focusing on this topic? Why is it important to North Texas? So the federal, again, the U.S. Department of Transportation has indicated this is a topic they would like local governments to be aware of and invest in. You can see they've created a Center for Innovative Finance Support, and there are other names around that program. But essentially, they're asking local governments to look at value capture because nationwide, there's simply not enough funding to go around for all the transportation improvements we know that our communities need. There's a chart here that I pulled from the U.S. Department of Transportation, Bureau of Transportation Statistics, that is an index of highway roadway construction costs over the last 20 years. And of course, no surprise to any of you, but it has continued to climb and go up in cost, necessitating the need for more funding resources. And then on our next slide, I just have a little bit more from the U.S. Department of Transportation around their support of this topic. So if you're interested in learning more in depth on particular tools, I've highlighted a few webinars that are coming up in the near future on this topic from the U.S. Department of Transportation. And you can go to that URL there and register. We will provide that in a follow-up email. And this presentation, I should say, will be posted on our website as well. Okay, so, and I'll also mention that if you have questions, go ahead and drop those in the chat for us. Feel free to mention them as I'm getting going. So again, why is COG interested in talking about value capture? So we have in the past executed agreements with local governments and been approached by local governments on using particularly TIF revenues to help fund transportation projects where COG acts as the entity providing a loan. And more than one jurisdiction has approached us on this particular topic. So we have a need to have some background on this particular topic, especially what are the expectations for value capture in terms of its funding capacity? And then along with that, what is the feasibility and what are the trends related to their performance? And so we also, again, echoing the U.S. Department of Transportation, want to say jurisdictions in our region should probably continue using value capture. And from the perspective of large transportation infrastructure, it can provide gap funding in some cases, or complete revenue for the entire project. And it's also, of course, local money. And when you're thinking about federal versus local, these local funds, rather, with value capture, allow you to do innovative projects with designs like complete streets or other things that may be more difficult with certain federal funds. So that's a bit on why value capture. Now I want to move into talking about what we're doing and the upcoming report that I alluded to. So it is in draft right now. We're finalizing our draft of this, and some of you on the call have received a request from us to review a case study of your community. And I thank you for your comments that have been provided on those case studies. But of course, we're doing this to inform what we do at the Council of Governments in our regional funding partnerships. We also, in the effort of promoting value capture, wanted to know exactly how effective and what is going on in the region in terms of value capture tools. And of course, as we always do, we want to provide information to you, our local governments and our stakeholders who are assisting them as a technical tool to understand their regional trends and sort of outcomes regionally. So this can also be shared with other stakeholders like elected officials or people in land use planning who maybe don't deal with the direct implementation. We're sort of writing it from that perspective. And of course, as I mentioned before, as we look at partnering with cities on ongoing transportation funding, having some background on the topic is beneficial to council governments. All right, so we're going to release this report in later this spring or this summer, so later this year. We'll of course send folks an email to let them know that's available. So if we go to the next slide, what we're really focused on and what we're going to hear about today in that report is the three most common value capture tools in the Dallas-Fort Worth region. Those are in orange. It's TIFs, tax increment reinvestment zones, public improvement districts, and impact fees. And I would also say these are the ones moving the most dollars into projects in the region. In the gray bracket 4 through 7, we have tools that you will see in the Metroplex, but they're not always used for transportation, and their dollar amounts tend to be smaller when it comes to what they're doing. Of course, naming rights is all over the place, but we only briefly discussed that in the report. And then 8 and 9 are authorized for use in Texas, but to our knowledge, no one in the Dallas-Fort Worth region, or rather the metropolitan planning area, is using those. So moving on to our next slide, I'll just kind of briefly touch on, introduce these three most common tools. But of course, our panel speakers are going to dive into these in a little more detail with examples. So tax increment reinvestment zones, also known as tax increment finance districts. Based on comptroller data and searching some websites, we believe there are 155 tax increment reinvestment zones in the 12-county metropolitan planning area. From the 90s through recently, we think that there was over 1.7 billion in taxable value raised in those districts. 70% of the cities in North Texas are using at least one TIRZ. And when it comes to financing projects, these project volumes and amounts in those TIF districts usually 1 million to 10 million per year. And of course, wide variation because of those of you who use TIF districts know you can fund a wide variety of things themed around economic development. That includes roads, potentially contributing to housing or economic partnerships with small businesses. And so when we looked at just a case study of a handful of TIFs, we found that about half of them would use the TIF money for an infrastructure or transportation infrastructure project. So that just kind of shows you it can fund a lot of transportation, but there's diverse applications of TIF money, as again, I think many of our stakeholders know. And so let's go on to the PID overview here. Just going to try and okay, so PIDs, almost as common as TIFs in our region. Because to our knowledge, PIDs are not reported in the same way as TIFs, it was a little bit more difficult to find broad reaching information on PIDs. But we did look at the websites of the 50 largest cities in the metropolitan area and found 103 districts, estimated 103. Again, sometimes documentation on these is diverse and not as easy to locate in each jurisdiction. But we think it's important when you talk about PIDs and their funding capacity to acknowledge the dual sort of existence of PIDs. And we're using the term debt PID and PAYGO PID. So as the name implies, a debt PID, there's a large upfront financing where money is borrowed to pay for typically a larger value capital project. So like an arterial road or a water infrastructure for a new development. And those are typically focused on vacant land or redevelopment land that's been cleared to have new development come in. And based on our limited sample, we think those typically have a little bit higher assessment rate as well because of the high cost associated. Now, on the flip side of this, what I think you could also call more traditional PID is the PAYGO PID that tend to be imposed on existing developments, where you have property owners agreeing to a sort of set assessment rate, and then whatever that rate yields will be what they use to pay for certain needed services, which often are maintenance, security, business promotion, like marketing type things. And typically those are in downtown or dense, more urban neighborhoods. Or they can also be in suburban neighborhoods for various maintenance beautification elements related to those places. So their budgets tend to be smaller, but they can amass up to a substantial amount of money if that money is set aside. But of course, there's wide variation based on what the different PIDs are doing. And then interestingly, in our region, we observed that there is quite a bit of overlap geographically between PIDs and TIFs. And in some cases, it seems, and maybe we can get into this in today's discussion, that the PID is maybe a fallback funding mechanism. But again, that's something I think we can clarify later on. So to the last item that we're going to have in our discussion today is impact fees. Roadway impact fees to be particular, because the state law says you have to spend them on roadways, or rather things in a thoroughfare plan. But again, documentation on impact fees, there's not like a single inventory you can go to. So we looked at the 50 largest cities, looked at their websites to look for impact fees, and we found 31 of the 50 are using them. And I think just anecdotally, quite a few have implemented in the last decade or so. And so these fees can be used to generate quite a bit of money annually. Or again, depending on the fee, depending on the jurisdiction, a very small amount of money. Well, not very small, I shouldn't say $500,000 is very small, but in comparison to 15 million. So again, a little wide variation depending on the jurisdiction. And as I mentioned earlier, state law says you can only spend this on new expanded capacity improvements on a thoroughfare roadway plan network. And of course, DFW has seen a lot of growth in the region lately. So that's really helped this tool be effective because it's triggered by new development by developers and owners initiating new development that is in an area where a fee can be applied. And so many cities, as we've seen, are benefiting from this tool. So those are the three, that's a very high level overview of the three most common tools we're going to hear more about. On my next slide, I'll get into within our report sort of main regional takeaways, and I will mention this is draft. But our recommendations, if cities are not already using value capture, they should consider it and expand their use of it because of its capacity to generate revenue. We also would encourage cities to think about using higher density in these places where they have specific value capture tools for a district because there is more value to capture and efficiency there. Cities with vacant land, it seems that if you have vacant land using some of these value capture districts, all of the three that I just mentioned, might be a really good idea to recover some of that cost and pay for the infrastructure needs there. Of course, again, this may be something that many know well, but with these districts, it seems your highest bang for the buck can happen when a public-private partnership is happening in an area to catalyze that value. And so planning for that may be an important element of success there. As I mentioned, we saw a trend of jurisdictions layering TIF districts with PID districts to add funding capacity. So that may be something jurisdictions need to consider as they look to making these a reliable funding source. And then the final point here, best practice that COG is asking for is if you partner with us, don't submit a black box of revenue capacity. But we want to see the estimation for how that can be generated and see the background finance plan and make sure that's clear. So that's all spelled out in our forthcoming report. So that's just a little sample of where that is headed. So on our next slide, let's focus on what we're doing today. As I mentioned, that report we'll put it on our website. If you're plugged in to our Surface Transportation Technical Committee, we'll probably make an announcement there later this year. But this afternoon, I've invited a few cities to talk about these three most common tools in the region and how they're implementing them in their cities to fund both infrastructure and non-infrastructure improvements, and share with us their insights on what they're doing that helps reveal some regional issues we think you all could learn from. So that's my presentation. If you've got questions for me, you can go ahead and put those in the chat. I want to give our guest panelists plenty of time to speak, so I'll address those at the end in our panel conversation. And throughout our conversation here, if you have questions for the panelists specific to their jurisdiction or general, go ahead and drop those in the chat and we'll see if we can address them. But with that, on our agenda, our first speaker is Mr. Dusty McAfee. Dusty, did I pronounce that right? It's McAfee?
Yeah, it's McAfee, like the virus software.
Fantastic. All right. Well, Dusty, if you're ready to go, feel free to take it away and tell us about how you guys in Celina are advancing value capture.
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity. I think I really enjoyed the best practices and recommendations slide that you just went over. I think in today's environment, especially with the state law context that's continually changing, most often against cities, I think a lot of those best practices are a lot of things that cities traditionally, in Dallas-Fort Worth especially, never really had to consider, but today really should. I think it also kind of describes Celina's approach to how we manage our exponential growth. As for me, I have a master's in public administration, also went to law school. This is my third city to manage development services in, and I live in downtown McKinney. So I definitely appreciate Jennifer and her team taking such wonderful care of my neighborhood. Next slide, please. So a quick introduction to Celina. We have the second largest geographic boundary footprint in Collin County. That's probably not known by very many. So at build out, Frisco and Plano will be competing for third and fourth in our region behind McKinney and Celina in terms of both population and geographic footprint. And we've been leading the region for several years now on new home starts. And one thing that we have is about 10 miles of DNT in Preston. That's more mileage than any city not named Dallas. And we also have another 8 miles of the Collin County Outer Loop. So Life Connected is not just the city's tagline. It is also, Celina is well connected, geographically well positioned in terms of future growth. Next slide. You can see some of the new home permit numbers, of course. Again, we've been leading the region the past couple of years. Next slide. So we've also been very proactive. So we're very appreciative of our city council and city management in terms of the support they give us in order to ensure that we have all the tools in our toolbox to manage this record-breaking growth. At the very bottom, you see high standards, easy process that is highlighted and bolded for a reason. I'll get to that hopefully if I remember at a later slide. Next. This slide, everybody knows that in 2017, the state laws changed on annexation. One thing I want to point out is that we've probably annexed over roughly 20 square miles of land since then. We're in a very unique situation, however. We're probably the only city that has our situation in the state, where we had 60 square miles of ETJ a few years back. So our ultimate growth boundary, we had to be more assertive with how we were annexing. And we'll get to the purposes of annexation, which leads into this conversation at a later time as well. Next. So our approach is largely based upon development agreements, and these agreements they have very common elements. These things, they outline the developer's infrastructure obligations and fees. We're definitely focused on transportation in this regard. Annexation is the first step, of course. And then we also require extensive open space and integrated trail systems, and of course conformance with all city design standards. And then we're also very aggressive in preserving future sites for schools, fire stations, parks, water towers, water reclamation plants, you name it. If it's on our master facility plan, it's going to be added to the development agreement. Next. This map kind of shows you guys kind of what we've been working on. We're currently, we only have really 2 fire stations. Number 3 is under construction, but we have umpteen different fire stations secured through development agreements. So when some of these properties begin developing in 20 years, we're not going to have to pay 2040 market rate for land. We already have that land dedicated to us through the development agreement. So we're trying to be proactive and make sure we're saving future residents, taxpayers money as early as possible. So this kind of just shows you, just in terms of public safety, how development agreements can be used to honor taxpayers. Next. So in values, I think in terms of the water development,
Dusty, you cut
I
out
think
there.
for us, a lot of cities sometimes struggle to have developers work with them proactively in a trustful relationship. I think for us, one of the reasons we succeed in that is because of our values. We believe in quality, functional, safe, and aesthetically pleasing development. We also believe in a predictable outcome. We want to make sure the regulatory framework we offer is something that is predictable for those who are investing their money in our community. And of course, stewardship. This is in terms of internal staff management. We do not tolerate bad attitudes or low performers, and that pays dividends when you're having to do a lot of. I mean, these development agreements are not easy. They're complicated. They can be complicated, and you have to have people that are that are punctual and capable of performing. And then, of course, we're results driven. I think a lot of people are guilty, especially in the planning industry, being too legalistic in how they approach development, or they see developers as bad or bad or good. And it's not that you shouldn't really pass a judgment on development. You just need to make sure that in the end result, development's working for you. And so we try to be more results driven and less legalistic in nature. Next. So surviving today, we mentioned, of course, there's so many state law changes, especially in terms of annexation. Annexation, of course, gets into property rights, a very delicate and emotional subject. However, it's more about development rights. It's really about developers' rights and what they don't really want to pay for. And annexation is how you keep a long-range tax rate that is respectable to the taxpayers. And I think that's how you really talk to, especially the red cities out there in the red counties. How you have that conversation is that it's not about property rights, which is a sacred which is sacred in Texas. It's also about low taxes, which is also sacred. So you're putting two sacred values competing with one another when you have the annexation discussion. CEcD certifications are so much easier today. Another state law change recently. If you can't get water and sewer, if you can't help structure the developer's deal to obtain utilities for them, they'll just decertify or put up a package plant. I mean, it's easy these days. So cities, we can't just sit there and say it's on our master utility and trails plan, figure it out, like we probably did in the 80s and 90s. Today, if their project can't pencil, the only option they have is to decertify you or put up package plants, form a district or something of that nature. Cities now have to go and problem solve the developer's development and help their project pencil in order to ensure you don't get a water district on your perimeter. So it's about being solution minded and simplifying things and just being nimble. Next. So again, what we try to do is we try to leverage the needs of both the developer and the city. Oftentimes those run parallel and are shared needs. We all have impact fees and things of that nature. So what we try to do is come up with, every ordinance reads, the first 2 lanes of concrete adjacent to the project has to be built by the developer. We look at what's needed for the region most specifically. And then in the development agreement, we try to find out what they and the city can agree to in order to achieve better transportation for the region faster. And of course, anything remaining that's on the table goes back to the city in terms of capital recovery fees. We do not really we have impact fees, but in every development agreement, we transfer these into capital recovery fees. The reason why is because in impact fees, especially roadway, you may have 14 service areas in your city. Well, if you need a bridge in service area 10, or maybe a collector street, and really only service area 4's coffers are built up, you can't really do budget allocations and transfers to accomplish that. If you, through development agreements, have these coming back to you in capital recovery fees, you have more freedom as a city to allocate resources in a more expeditious manner to resolve the transportation needs of your residents. And then, of course, we offer tax stack options, and that's the PIDs, the in-city MUDs, if they're coming into city limits. We had Huffines for the first time ever agree to annex into city limits with us in our northeast quadrant. MMDs. I know there's a lot of opinions and probably misconceptions regarding various financing options, and we're happy to talk about some of those, at any time. Next slide. So PIDs, they expire. I like how you set up the pay-go versus maintenance PIDs earlier. If you set them up as the ones that expire, you're fine. A lot of people misunderstand that PIDs are not an extra cost to the taxpayer, to the existing residents. They're passed on to future residents to pay for infrastructure serving their neighborhoods. So those costs are passed to the ultimate consumer anyway. So if you didn't have a PID, the developer would just simply have a higher price point for ultimately the builder through the price point for their homes. The developer passes on that cost to the builder would pass it on to the consumer. So ultimately, this is just a different financing option. That's how I think a lot of cities need to probably start seeing these, is that these are financing options. They're not threats or anything to the city's credit line or anything of that nature. And then also it allows the city to negotiate improved amenities and design standards and trails. We have extremely high expectations being in the Tollway and Preston corridor markets. When people build, we're doing about 200 plus new homes each month, and the average value is probably 600,000 plus. When people, buy those homes that are half to $750,000 in value, they expect phenomenal amenities, and that's one thing we like to deliver. And then also it helps accelerate the development by bridging a lot of the structural gaps in the regional infrastructure. So we're able to tackle some of our infrastructure challenges quicker because we try to be a little bit more open-minded with how we work with developers. Next. So annexations, I think this is a part of the conversation that's unavoidable, especially for those who have large ETJs. State law does not allow counties to meaningfully regulate development. Texas counties cannot zone. I think one talking point that I know in the planning world APA, Texas APA, that we've acknowledged, but I'm not sure if it's very widely known. Texas is the only state in the entire union that both does not allow counties to zone and does not allow cities to annex. Every state, including Texas in the past, had at least one of those, if not both of those. But Texas is the first state ever that does not allow cities to annex nor counties to zone. And that is that's going to be curious how that works out over the next 50 years. Unregulated development negatively impacts property values. We know that. It places first responders at risk. The county does not have a fire department, and their sheriff's department, as you know, will not respond. So that's another talking point for annexation is that our first responders, their lives are placed at risk when responding to unsafe facilities and developments. Next. Another reason for annexations that places more burden on the development community is where I think most people thinks it belongs. Developers need to kind of pay to play, and annexation is how you force developers to pay to play. Ensures more orderly growth. You're able to actually implement some of those master thoroughfare plans and whatnot. And of course, I think any city that has an ETJ, city taxpayers are already subsidizing services and infrastructure to the ETJ. And I think, obviously, again, like I mentioned earlier, development rights versus, basically the tax rate, those are both highly conservative ideals that are in competition when you logically talk annexation. And of course, the more city limits you have, the lower the tax rate. Next. And of course, I mean, a lot of this conversation depends upon the local politics. Not every situation and climate has the sophistication or the positive politics to be able to have these policy conversations. So a lot of things that we talk about in Celina that I always talk to the Planning and Zoning Commission about and City Council is basically the easy wrong versus the hard right decision making. I think it's when you put on your political hat, you make the easy wrong decision. When you're a politician hat, when you put on your elected official hat, you can make the hard right decisions, and that can be challenging for many because it's not easy being an elected official. We always teach that a lot of the public input will be emotional and fear based. That should be anticipated. It should be listened to. We absolutely should try to resolve the concerns of that feedback. However, governing to the vocal minority may not be the best policy. And then, of course, maintain altitude. Policy making really shouldn't get into the weeds. That's administration and management. It's a lot easier to make decisions when you're at your proper altitude of 40,000 feet. If you're at 4 inches, 4 feet, or 400 feet, you're really you're flying really low, and that can be problematic. And then, of course, the policy direction, not the administration. We're not designing from the dais. We are really trying to set policy, and that's a really quick presentation. That's kind of an overview of how Celina tries to approach these things. We try to provide outstanding customer service. We try to think outside of the box. We try to be market based. I think one of the bigger talking points that we've danced around is that with a lot of the state law changes, one of the reasons Dallas-Fort Worth has had such a strong economy is because our cities are so successful compared to every other region in the United States, including Texas. Our cities are very strong. And part of that's because we've had, annexation and city limits. So I think the future for the soon-to-be developing cities in this region, the ones that are on the periphery, there are 30,000 people that are home rural, about to be hit with 40,000 people over the next 10 to 20 years. They don't have the mechanisms to achieve the same history and milestones that the first 100 something cities in the Metroplex experienced. It's very possible that we're in the last of the cities, the Melissas, the Annas, the Dentons, the Prospers, the Celinas, even the Forneys, and all you go around the Metroplex. We're the last cities that have enough girth to really be self-sufficient. After that, you're going to see a bunch of towns of 3,000 surrounded by a dozen different water districts, and it's going to be more of a Houston or Hill Country styled development pattern. And that's going to be a change to our region with how we operate. So I think cities really need to be more open-minded to some of these financing mechanisms so we can negotiate these developments into city limits and not have just basically this endless supply of water districts that are unregulated in terms from a city standpoint. So that's everything I have. I'd be happy to answer any questions or explain or clarify anything. But I think that should be my last slide, I believe.
Thanks, Dusty. That was definitely a good perspective from your experience in Celina and those elements there with a growing city with lots of ETJ. If anybody has technical questions for Dusty that's pretty specific to Celina, go ahead and drop those in the chat or raise your hand. Let us know you want to talk really quick before we move on. Dusty, I had one technical follow-up related to your PID districts. So in my mind, Celina's kind of experienced a lot of development within the past 20 years. And so with the agreements you all have signed, especially with PID districts, none of them have faced expiration yet. Is that correct?
Oh, the PID districts, all of ours are set to expire. I mean, was that the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, but that hasn't happened yet. Y'all haven't had to deal with what comes next. You are still in the midst of them being active for the most part.
Oh yeah, we're in the beginning. We're in the beginning phases. We're still issuing new PIDs all the time. Right. Again, it's not a cost to our taxpayer. It's really a cost of that future residents are paying for basically for their own neighborhoods. And it's a cost they would have to bear anyway, either through usually through a higher price point for their homes if PIDs were not considered.
Great. Well, it'll be interesting to follow everything that's happening in Celina as the region grows and y'all grow. So Dusty, just hang out and we'll invite you back for our panel discussion. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce Craig Hulse with City of North Richland Hills. And he'll be telling us about a really cool project they've got going. So Craig, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Travis, and good to meet all of you and converse with you. The following slides are pretty much the nuts and bolts of not only a PID, but also how a TIF interacts with the PID. But also, if any of your communities are trying to get up underneath a declining mall, this is a blueprint as well to possibly dig out of that. Next slide. We had a mall called North Hills Mall. It was built in the mid-90s, but by 2004, it began to decline, and in 2007, it was effectively closed. There was a competing mall too close by, and this just fell out of favor, and so it became a nuisance to the city. Next slide. That by 2007, it became condemned and was demolished. Next slide. So between 2008 and 2016, the city had a grand vision, and during this period as well, you also had the rise of e-commerce, changing trends, changing shopping patterns. The city did its best to pursue new uses, the typical tried and true ones such as big box retail, shopping centers, even hotels and entertainment. The situation, however, did not necessarily afford it because of its proximity to Northeast Mall and Hearst. Again, online shopping. We had multiple construction projects, most recent North Tarrant Express, and then throw in the Great Recession. So a citizen-led committee said, something has to be done over a decade of nothing happening on this particular property. And we actually relocated City Hall as an anchor set back in at the time, a 80-acre property. Next slide. During that time, once City Hall was developed, the planning department for North Richland Hills brought together all the other departments, including economic development, formed a citizen-led committee to essentially not only update the comprehensive land use plan, but the strategic plan for North Richland Hills called Vision 2030. Within that, a considerable amount of discussion centered on what to do with this mall, and it was warranted that it required some unique identity in the form of a mixed-use urban village. Once that was identified, supported by the community, next slide, we then sought a developer who could not only accomplish this, but work with us in the form of being able to master plan, put together a project that would have all the elements of a properly planned community when it comes to complete streets, design elements, open space, amenities, what have you. And we ended up working with a developer to master plan a project that included 364 homes. That 300 to 600 is actually 600 multifamily units with 70,000 square feet of commercial space and a hotel. And you can just see how the design is laid out. Next slide. What was forecasted with this is what was it going to spin off as far as taxable value and development value. And you can see here that in the early stages of the project, not much, in fact, under 20 million. But over time, it was estimated and forecasted to be about 180 million. When we put this together, we forecasted 180 million. However, as you can probably attest with your appraisals that you may have received in your mailbox over the past couple weeks, what you're hearing in the news, this project is probably north of 225 million now, as far as the values of all the properties that are being developed. Next slide. So in order to make this happen, there was a very significant hurdle to accomplish, and that is you had a person who bought a mall. They paid over $20 million at the time to buy a mall, and the sales price was $20 million. Not only was it a high price for raw land, but it was also encumbered with a tremendous amount of obsolete and abandoned infrastructure, streets, water, sewer, that weren't in use and needed to be demolished. So in order to accomplish this cost gap or this financial hurdle, we worked with the master developer and considered two things. One, a TIF, but also a PID. And really the rationale for that, and this is something I encourage you to capture, take a picture of, or share with others, is you need a rationale to justify both a TIF and a PID. Is in this case, it was a catalyst for redevelopment and revitalization. Secondly, it closed the cost hurdle to demolish and abandon past infrastructure, but also construct new infrastructure. Three, because of the city's participation in the TIF and the PID, it gave us a larger level of stakeholder partnership, ensuring a quality mixed-use development. It also provided a definitive acceleration of development of this project. We had waited 10 years for activity, and it was nice to have a definitive schedule. And finally, it was able to spur economically sustainable uses. Next slide. To just try and understand what that means is, with a PID, you kind of have to identify what is going to take place. Now, I'm not going to go over this, but essentially a PID is something where you fund infrastructure ahead of time. And as our previous presenter indicated, it's passed on to the property owners. In this case, the PID in City Point has a term of 30 years and covers the cost of streets, water, sewer, drainage, and park amenities. It doesn't have to include all of those for a PID district, but in our case, those are the elements. And the price tag at the time was 12.6 and remains $12.6 million. Next slide. When you do a PID, you have to understand what is needed, how it's designed, and these are just pictures that just show the former mall site overlaid by the various levels of public infrastructure, the roads, the sewer, the storm, and the water, in order to get an accurate reading of what the PID would pursue. Next slide. With a PID, especially if the PID is being designed to issue debt to provide the capital to fund infrastructure, what happens is, and this is another element, is you need expert services to surround you, not just city staff, not just the developer. And these are the 5 that we worked with, the specific folks. I highly recommend, if a PID is considered, that you consider a consultant, a financial advisor, a bond counsel, an underwriter, and even counsel for the underwriter. Next slide. So how does it work? And for the folks that live in PIDs, we in North Richland Hills have positioned it as basically it's an extra HOA payment every year. And PIDs, how they're designed, they're designed to be able to plug and play with the county as far as assessment of a property when it comes to your property tax bill. And we have worked with the county such that every year property owners within the PID will be paying for their share of the PID expenses over the period through their tax bill. They're able to escrow it into their escrow on the mortgage, and they're able and when you essentially divide it by 12 months, it's essentially an HOA payment. One thing about a PID assessment is property owners do have the option of paying it up front. So in this case, the buyout per lot is about $30,000. Essentially, they're paying for the infrastructure and the development of their lot. The benefit of PID, one thing to keep in mind is that it does not make the city liable. It does not make the county liable. The PID is basically guaranteed by the payments of those folks that own the land that's within the PID. They're not COs or GOs that are backed by the full faith and credit of the city. And no TIF bond, in this case, no TIF bond issuances are contemplated. But I'll explain how the TIF plays within this. Next slide. So the relationship of a TIF and PID in this particular instance is a TIF was created to help buy down the property owner's PID obligation each and every year. So while a PID was created, we also established a TIF, and I'll get into the mechanics on the next slide. But it basically how the TIF goes, so does the amount of its contribution into the PID costs. And so the better off the project is, the lower the PID obligation by the property owners. Next slide. Visually, you can see a chart, a table here that just shows in the red line the annual TIF bond payment over the life of the PID. The different colors are associated here. The red, right now in the early phases of the development, the developer is paying those PID obligations. But you can see multifamily in the project has an obligation, as does the residential. But what helps buy that down is the city and the county combining into a TIF and also providing TIF revenues to buy down that particular PID obligation. Next slide. The city's participation is not the full life of the PID. It's only 20 years. We broke it out by actually applying only our M&O rate, 45% of that, but 25 on a blended. And once it caps out at $4,200,000, the TIF would expire. And those TIF dollars will go specifically towards those uses that you see here. Meantime, but for the city authorizing a PID, but for the city participating in a TIF, we would not see this development occur, nor would we see the $12,500,000 over the next 20 years in property tax benefit from the project that's outside of the PID. So we're essentially making $12,500,000 from this project, and but for the TIF and the PID, we would not see that happen. Next slide. We were able to get the county to participate, same level, same period, not to exceed 1.7 million. And because of their participation and the ability to make this project move forward, they stand to benefit by receiving $5 million over a 20-year period. Next slide. Visually speaking, you can see here, we wish ISDs would participate in TIFs. In this case, the ISD does not, nor does Tarrant County College. We're in Tarrant County, and the hospital district. But you can see the return on investment of the net benefit for both the city and the county over the life of the TIF district. Next slide. And to round it out, just some visuals here. You can see the City Hall in the background of this former mall site. Groundbreaking took place in early 2000, and you can see just the sheer magnitude of concrete and asphalt that had to be dug up, as well as underground sewer, what have you, to get this project going. Frame of reference, you can see downtown Fort Worth in the background. Next slide. As of April 2022 last year, just a picture of the PID dollars at work. Next slide. And the metamorphosis of the effort in August of last year to, I believe, the final slide, which is March of this year. We expect full build out of City Point in 2025, and we're exceeding expectations with regards to values that have been driven off the project, and more than happy to take any questions offline to guide any folks on the mechanics of either one, the TIF or the PID, or how they work together. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Craig. That was a very good detailed dive into this project and the mechanics of it. And yeah, if anybody has specific questions for this project, I'd invite them to drop those questions in the chat right now, or if you've got a more broad question, save for a panel discussion. Craig, one technical point that I think I caught there was, so you have both the TIF and the PID, and the rationale for that layer was the bond through the PID was secured by the PID, thus reduced the liability from the city. So you wouldn't have that with TIF because of the, I guess, uncertainty of value increases. Whereas with a PID, that you know that assessments are going to be assessed no matter what, so that backs the bond, thus reduces the likelihood the city will have to pick it up. Is that sort of the rationale there?
Yeah, in fact, the city would not have to pick it up. Theoretically, if the PID were to go underwater or whatnot, it would foreclose on the property, and the property is in and of itself the guarantor. And so that's the benefit of PIDs, is that they're not necessarily liable or have to be underwritten or backstopped by the city or the county.
Good to know. Good to know. And that, yeah, plays into that theme that I had mentioned. Our overview is we see areas where PIDs and TIFs being layered. So as you mentioned, cities should have a justification for that as they take that approach. So good to know. All right. Well, Craig, if you would hang out, and we'll get to our panel discussion here in a minute. I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Jennifer from the city of McKinney, switching gears to a different sort of value capture mechanism, impact fees. So Jennifer, take it away.
Thanks, Travis, and thank you, Dusty and Craig. I think the use of special financing districts is the way of the future for development in cities. And so it was really interesting to see some of the ways that you all have used them. As Travis said, we're kind of shifting gears to maybe something that's not quite as high profile as the special financing districts, but roadway impact fees and some of the important roles that we think they play, especially here in McKinney. If you could switch to the next slide, please. So as we all likely know, impact fees, they're a one-time fee for new development, and we can utilize them to recover infrastructure costs based on a rough proportionality concept. This is really important for communities such as McKinney because we do have a lot of infrastructure needs, not only for new growth, but maintenance needs as well. And one of the foundational uses of impact fees for us here in McKinney is to help free up some of our funding capacities to focus on maintenance, because impact fees are not allowed to be used on maintenance projects and only for new development. Being able to fully utilize them to help fund new construction for new development really does help draw down what we have available to use for maintenance costs on existing roadways. Next slide, please. So some of the things that we have learned in McKinney as we implement our impact fee program is to make sure that all of the players at the table are understanding of some of the common terminology and the way in which that we use and govern impact fees. This goes from the beginning of things when we are looking at either adopting the ordinance at the beginning to doing those 5-year annual updates and being able to effectively communicate with our development partners about how we look at roadway impact fees, how we calculate what those fees are, and how we are able to utilize those fees to support either offsets and credits for their development or for larger projects in the city for residents that live here or will live here in the future. Next slide, please. Impact fees, as I said earlier, are incredibly important for communities such as McKinney, similar to what Dusty was sharing with Celina. The McKinney ultimate planning boundary is quite large. We are only about halfway built out. So what you'll see on the left there is our ultimate planning boundary, known as our ETJ. We have had some slight modifications there on that eastern boundary with New Hope, where we've had some boundary agreements change some of that area. But by and large, we anticipate that we're going to be about 115 square miles when we're all grown up. And being able to effectively plan for constructing new roadways while also having enough resources to maintain the miles and miles of roadways that exist today are really important to us. So that map there on the left highlights the projects that are currently in our impact fee improvement plan. And those are the backbone of the current impact fee assessments that we charge for developments in McKinney. I talked earlier about understanding the mechanics from state law in terms of what we can charge for impact fees and the common terminology. This became very important for us as we started talking with our city council about what they wanted to charge in terms of impact fees. I don't know how other councils are, but I know that here in McKinney, they're very development conscious, and they want to make sure that if they charge or if we are going to be charging an assessment or a fee for a new development, that they understand the rationale behind it, because their natural desire is to want to keep fees low. And impact fees are ones where we would actually recommend to our council that you try and maximize as much of that impact fee as possible. State law does limit how much we're able to actually charge in terms of impact fees. There's two different methodologies that you can utilize. We in McKinney utilize a cost recovery where we are actually able to try and maximize how much impact fees we can gain back from a development project. But that only covers about half of what our total anticipated infrastructure needs are, which is what you'll see there on the right side of the screen there. So we anticipate over the next 10 years that we'll have about $565 million worth of roadway infrastructure needs. State law caps what we're able to actually recover from that, which is about $300 million. And so being able to maximize that so that we can stretch the city dollars, similar to what Dusty said about state law changes, the amount that we're able to collect and recover in property taxes is constantly changing, and it seems like they're trying to chip away at that every legislative session. So being able to recover as much of those development fees as possible is really, really important. Next slide. So this is just a highlight of how we've actually been able to utilize impact fees here in McKinney. What we do twice a year is present a semi-annual report to our city council on how many dollars we're recovering in our impact fees. You'll see that in last year we were able to capture about $10 million in impact fees. One thing that I want to highlight is we do offer offsets and credits with our impact fees, and it is one of our standard negotiating tools when we are trying to lure or work with a development partner. It is a standard incentive that we look at where we're able to actually either waive or reduce or offset the impact fees that would otherwise be collected. And so while you can see on the chart that last year we collected about $10 million in real impact fee dollars, it does not account for roadway projects that were constructed by a private developer whereby they were given a credit or a waiver of their impact fees for that construction. And so similar to looking at TIFs and PIDs as an innovative financing tool, we do also here in McKinney look at those impact fees as a negotiation tool or an incentive when trying to partner with the developer coming in and developing here in McKinney. Next slide, please. So the $10 million that you saw on that previous slide was used to fund several projects throughout McKinney. Now, these impact fee dollars don't fund the total cost of every project. We normally layer it on with other things like bonds and other revenue sources, but we're able to use that to help supplement these infrastructure projects so that we can have a better reach in terms of roadway construction and widening and improvement projects within the city. And I think that is my last slide, but you can. Yep. So impact fees may not be as sexy as PIDs and TIFs and TIRZ, but it is a really great resource for Texas cities. It does support this notion of growth paying for growth, which in this ever-changing region is really, really important in my opinion, especially when we're looking at all of these other partnerships and financing tools to help ensure that communities, especially here in North Texas, can provide the quality of services and infrastructure that our residents have come to expect. And so we think that this is a great value capture, since that's sort of the topic of today. It's a great value capture opportunity for communities here in the region. And I think Jeff is hopping in next to talk more about that regional perspective and use of impact fees.
Hey, thanks, Jennifer. That was very insightful, especially the negotiating aspect of this. I hadn't had that on my radar. So yeah, if anybody has questions specifically for Jennifer in the McKinney context, go ahead and drop those in the chat. As Jennifer mentioned, we've also got Jeff Whitacre here with us from Kimley-Horn, who of course assisted the city of McKinney with their impact fee assessment plan, as well as many other cities in the region. And so we're going to keep the conversation going around those impact fees. And as you know, Jennifer nicely set up, they're pretty significant in terms of a funding tool. So Jeff, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to kind of expand on that from your perspective.
Thanks, Travis. Today, as Travis mentioned, I'm going to be putting a little bit of a regional hat on, but then halfway through the presentation, I'm putting the city of Fort Worth hat on and giving a presentation about their experience of what, similar to what you heard from Jennifer, of what their experience is. So if you want to go to the next slide. The next slide. So why is this important? And these are just kind of 5 topics I feel like why cities look towards impact fees for a value capture opportunity. One is infrastructure costs greatly exceed the traditional tax and free collection rates in fast growing cities. I think as we've heard through the different funding sources, through Craig and Dusty kind of talking about, is we're looking for different ways to have growth pay for infrastructure because the costs are exceeding the other tax revenue sources, especially when it's fast growing city. The example I use is, why wasn't impact fees used in the Northeast, like in New York City? Well, New York City, if you actually look historically, grew 1 or 2% a year for a long time. Texas cities are growing double digits. So it's really hard for our tax base to keep up when you're growing double digits. The other item, which might be a little bit less true now that the federal government is putting more emphasis on some of the Investment in Infrastructure Act that came out, some of the Safe Streets for All. But generally speaking, federal and state funding for infrastructure is not keeping up with the need. More and more pressure in Texas is on the cities to even fund some of their FM roads and some of their state roads. So there's our partner with the state and federal government, and you have to have money for that partnership. So the partnerships previously, before the 80s, a lot of the states were building a lot of the roadways in the area. Another one is Texas laws. Many of you on this call know does not allow for growth management or concurrency. We're a property right state, so we don't allow for some of the states that allow you have to do all this stuff before you can build. We don't allow for that or put a moratorium on building. Funding mechanism for infrastructure is especially limited in transportation. There's you don't hear about this as much on water. Are y'all hearing me okay, Travis? Is that what's the technical?
I can still hear you, Jeff, just fine. Okay.
I saw in the chat. And in Texas, transportation funding is limited. You don't hear a lot about the infrastructure as much on the water and wastewater side. There's a funding mechanism for that. Even on the drainage side, you hear a lot about needs for drainage, but now a lot of cities are enabling legislation for drainage utilities. As Travis mentioned at the very beginning, transportation utilities, there are cities across the state that are doing that. However, I think he's correct. I don't know of a city in the Metroplex that's currently doing a transportation utility or street maintenance fee, but there are cities outside of the region in Texas that are exploring that option. And then the last one is making sure growth pays for growth. I think that's a concept that's generally well accepted across most platforms, from the development community to the cities. Is the development community believes they should pay for their growth. They may believe what that cost of growth is, maybe a little differently than what, but generally speaking, I think there's a concept that they should cover their costs when they come in. Those are kind of 5 pillars I think about why transportation impact fees can be important in a city. For the next slide. As I've been working with communities, I've really had about 4 questions that get brought up as I do transportation impact fees. One of them I'll have to explain. The first one is smoothing the fees or the same rate everywhere. As Jennifer showed the slide of McKinney, I believe there's 13 service areas in McKinney. The question comes up, should we charge the same fee in all the areas? And if you think about it, in certain areas, if you have really expensive infrastructure with drainage facilities and other type of facilities, those infrastructure costs are going to be significantly more. So in the areas where you're charging the same fee, some areas are going to be winning, some areas are going to be losing. So there's a lot of discussion about, should we charge the same fee, same percentage? How should we calculate that? And so in certain communities, and I'll talk about the Fort Worth case, is they've gone from charging the same fee throughout the city to charging the same percentage throughout the city. So that fee varies throughout the city based on the infrastructure needs. Probably a conversation that could last this entire 2 hours is, what do we do about annexations? Not just in impact fees, but in general. That's been a large conversation. A lot of cities, for example, like the city of Lubbock, they built into their ordinance how to handle annexations in the impact fee process. There's a lot of questions about what to do with annexations. I'm not only hearing these questions really from cities around the region, I'm hearing it now from the counties, not from an impact fee perspective, but how do counties use development agreements, et cetera, to build transportation infrastructure? I think now that the cities are not having as much, aren't able to annex, the counties are getting more and more pressures of how to handle the existing transportation issues that maybe the cities were experiencing beforehand. The next line is, how do we account for inflation? I recently updated for a city their impact fee, and I compared their cost from 2017 to 2022, and that inflation was about 71%. That's probably a higher number than you think about there, but concrete and some of those elements have gone up at a higher rate than everything else. So if you just take that as an example, in order to keep pace with the cost of your impact fee, it would be a 71% increase from 2017 to 2022 in that particular city. And the last question I get about is, what about maintenance? Impact fees do not cover maintenance. And a lot of the cities in the Metroplex are now getting to the age where they're reinventing themselves. The cities that are kind of in the first ring suburbs are getting to the age where their infrastructure needs to be maintained. Well, the answer from a value capture standpoint is, if you have growth pay for growth, in theory, you're not subsidizing growth, and those extra dollars can be used for maintenance. But a lot of questions are now, more than ever, have been coming about PCI, pavement condition index, and what about the maintenance? So those are kind of the general questions that I hear across the Metroplex and how to deal with those. The next slide. To dive into a little bit about the Fort Worth history. In 2008, if you recall, in 2008, in the midst of a recession, the city of Fort Worth started collecting impact fees at a rate of $2,000 for a single family house. They also used impact fees as a way to encourage development. They did not charge within the loop, and they had a discounted rate in East Fort Worth, which is the historically underrepresented community. So they had a different discount rate. They decided in 2008 they needed to get the program going, so they set kind of a lower rate. They called that rate revenue neutral. They had done a bunch of calculations on previous plats and said this is about what they're building at this time. 2013, they updated the study. They raised the collection rate 50% to $3,000 per single family house. In 2017, now this may be an interesting fact, there was some calculation done between 2013 and 2017 that inflation rate was about 25%. So they, over that 5-year, as opposed to the 71% I just mentioned, this was about 25%. So they raised the collection rate in 2017 to, if you will, keep up with inflation at $37.50. And then in 2022, in the current update, it's actually adopted now. They are, they it was adopted around October. They are adopting a percentage, and that percentage is going to go up on a yearly basis. They basically are going up 5% each year, up to that 80%. So they're not starting at 80%; they're just going up at 5%. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the discussions is, do we charge a rate? The previous was $2,000, $3,000, and $3,750. Now they're doing a percentage of the maximum impact fee that they could charge. So in some areas, that maximum fee goes more upwards of $6,000, $7,000 a house. In some areas, it's less. So it really depends on where you are in the city and really what that true infrastructure cost is. The next slide. The Fort Worth story is really, they tried to keep a history of partnership. And that's kind of the story I want to say here. It's really a partnership. How do you split that cost, the value from a development and from fees being paid? And this is their history. I kind of described this briefly as we went through. The one thing I want to point out here is one tool does not fit everything. So when you see their history of partnership, some of it was revising their thoroughfare plan with better policies to allow them to build something different. They also updated their transportation engineering manual to have different requirements, which had kind of an enhanced traffic study portion to that. So really just to have the partnership between the development community and the city of Fort Worth through both impact fees as well as some development requirements. The next slide. So what was the impact? I think this is the slide that kind of sticks out to me. And these are all adjusted for 2017 dollars. We did not run this for 2023. But in 2008, really what spurred the city of Fort Worth is that when they looked at their needs, it was about $1.5 billion across the city. And the council's, that's a number. So oftentimes when you talk to citizens, and I think everyone on this call is probably aware, when they say transportation on community service is often in the top 3 on most cities. Well, when you go from 1.5 billion to an $800 million need, the citizens may not feel that on a citywide basis. It's still an $800 million need. However, they have started to chip away with it, and you can kind of see as they've chipped away with it, how that need has slowly dwindled away over time. And it's actually higher in 2023. We've preliminary, but it's really the inflation dollars that have made it higher. But it's actually still in the downward pace. They're chipping away over time. But they didn't do this just with impact fees. So the next slide was really how to leverage impact fees, city, and this is very similar to the story that Jennifer showed with the map of McKinney. You saw a lot of projects, they're not all funded by impact fees, but how do you leverage developer cost with city funds and the impact fee to get a total cost? So since 2017 to 2022, the city of Fort Worth has built $206 million worth of roadway infrastructure, really leveraging roughly $80 million of developer funds into that $206 million of infrastructure. And the next chart will show you a pie chart, which shows you very similar. Some people are number people, some people are pie charts. I think the pie chart's a little bit easier to read. Really, the city's been contributing 63% of their infrastructure fund, while the development community's been contributing 37%. So not quite a 50-50 partnership. Obviously, the city of Fort Worth also had a lot of existing needs out there. You can't expect developers to pay for those existing needs, but pretty much a 1/3, 2/3 split between the city funds and developer funds over the last 5 years. The next slide. This is kind of something that we just talked about from a partnership standpoint and from capturing the value. It's got to be a partnership. We've got the development-led improvements. That is the front leg of that. And I say this to most of my clients I work with is development can build the infrastructure typically cheaper and faster, and it gets on the ground at the time of the development. So how do you encourage developments to get built through negotiations? I think that's kind of the front leg. Then we have the bond projects and impact fees as the back legs. But if you kick one of the legs off, it falls down. So it's really about that partnership to keep that stool balanced. And the next slide is kind of summing it up. It's a partnership between the development community and the city. Development should pay its fair share, and that's through right-of-way dedication, street construction, intersection improvements. And the fair share is really mitigated. And the example is if your subdivision needs 2 lanes of traffic, you're responsible for building it. If the plan says you need 4, that's when the partnership comes in. Let's figure out what that partnership is. And the important thing is really just to understand developers are not responsible for existing conditions. we really need to have good understanding of who's responsible for what and creating that partnership, and getting that the existing conditions built and the future conditions established. And that's my last slide, I believe.
All right, Jeff, thank you for that. Very insightful elements there in your presentation on impact fees in the region. Hopefully everyone can hear us. We had the little issue with our Wi-Fi, but I think we're broadcasting clearly now. Jeff, just real quick, really liked your insight on the development partnership, and I think Jennifer alluded to it as well. Sort of the developer contributions, or what some might call like developer exactions. Yeah, in your one chart you showed for Fort Worth, at least, those were bigger in proportion than the contributions of the impact fees. Is that accurate? Did I get that right?
That's correct. The Fort Worth policy is to try to get development builds. One thing that I think Jennifer mentioned in her slide as well is if a developer does build a project that's on the capital improvement plan for the impact fee, they don't pay the impact fee as well. They get credit, if you will, for their fees due. So in a lot of cases, they're building the infrastructure, they may not pay an impact fee.
Yeah, so some perspective on value capture from that concept is we focused on impact fees because those are pretty clearly documented into how they are implemented. But it could be that in our region, in terms of value capture tools, getting the private sector to make those contributions is maybe the fourth big tool that's not necessarily on our formal value capture radar. Some insight there, I think. Does that sound like something that's consistent with y'all's experience?
It is. I would say, especially in McKinney, off-site improvements. So if their development necessitates the need to make a connection that doesn't exist from a primary roadway to their development, we actually, I guess I'd call it kind of pay premium for that in order to assist them with their development, but also help to get those roadway connections built. One thing that we've spent a lot of time talking about today is the changes in annexation law and the impacts that those have had for a lot of us here in North Texas. And I will say that because roadway impact fees are not accessible in our ETJ, we've really been looking at our roadway impact fees as one of the carrots, if you will, to entice annexation, where we're really looking at how can we, if you're in the ETJ and, we're able to come to an agreement on annexation, we are looking at innovative ways for using that, like either dollar for dollar credits on impact fees, or an enhanced calculation of impact fees in order to help make it more desirable for these ETJ properties to annex. Right now, with impact fees within the city limits and annexation laws and the ease for being able to develop in the ETJ being out there, it's really caused us to get creative on how do we help incentivize annexation, and those roadway impact fees is one of the things we've been looking at.
Yeah, Jennifer, as you mentioned, a lot of cities are interested in that annexation conversation. So I think that is good perspective is those carrots that can be offered, as you mentioned there.
And I haven't seen it in
yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
I haven't seen it in the Metroplex as much, but I know, for example, like Kendall County, which is in San Antonio, Bernie area, has recently developed a pretty robust transportation policy. It's not, they don't have impact fees because they don't have it, but counties, as I mentioned earlier, counties across the state are looking at ways to mitigate, I think, transportation areas when they would have when previous times land would have been annexed. It's almost the opposite of what Jennifer was saying, is they're trying to figure out how to mitigate the same things that cities used to mitigate when they were annexed.
So there's a whole nother APA
Topic.
Presentation on annexation in this conversation here as a current. Well, I want to take this time to invite those who are on our call to maybe add any questions for our panel. Anything you heard, any big ideas you want to get in front of our folks. And so feel free to put a question in the chat or raise your hand. I, of course, having worked on our report, have lots of questions for our panel. And I think my first is just generally, what is your big recommendation to your peer cities from your perspective on your project or your implementation of a particular tool?
I can jump in first. We've got to get creative. I think using some of these special financing districts and impact fees and the things that are allowed to us from state law or granted to us through state law, now more than ever, we've got to really start looking at how do we maximize those and get creative with those to help not only for annexation, but costs of land and cost of construction are going through the roof, which is causing development, to obviously cost more. And so a lot of folks are looking at cities to help bridge that gap, and we can't write a check for all of them. And so these tools that we have available to us, we got to figure out how to use them, maximize them to the best of our abilities. So that's kind of what we've been looking at, is how do we get as creative as possible to utilize these things to help ensure that we can still develop and provide quality services to our residents.
Yeah,
I'll jump in. Oh, go ahead, Craig. You go first. You're way more intelligent. Go first.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that comment. No, just two things. One is, I think while we're public servants, while we work for a government agency of some sort, or we're a consultant that works with the government agency, we're a business too. And so we have to generate a return in order to justify the ability to provide our services. And so these tools are here to help us manage our business and provide a return. So we're a business. The second comment is that, remember the the but-for statement. Are you at a crossroads with a particular area of your town or a particular project that, but for a TIF or but for a PID, it would not be able to move forward? I wouldn't recommend a TIF or a PID in areas that you think have high promise or are very attractive and may develop on their own. So keep in mind the but for component.
I think from my perspective, I enjoyed hearing everybody's their presentations. I think every city is in a slightly different situation. I know Celina's situation, we're in an extremely unique situation. We've probably annexed more land than every other city in the state combined since 2017. And frankly, that statement might be alarming to a lot of state legislative representatives. But I also think that the math of development, the development pattern for the past 80 years has been very consistent, very predictable. And there's been massive paradigm shifts in the past, 5 years at the state level. And so we have to, cities have to react. We have to think differently, think outside the box, and maybe reconsider some of the baseline understandings, like how Plano developed. Although Plano, Frisco, McKinney, and Celina all have very similar sizes and situations, we're not going to develop like Plano did. We're not going to develop like Frisco did. Frisco and Plano do not have ETJs, and they don't have that conversation because they already annexed all of it. And I know, like McKinney and Celina, we still have large ETJs that we have to plan for, that we have to provide services to in some way or the other. So I think one of the things I know we do with our development agreements, and I mentioned it, because we probably, we have dozens of these every year, but like we have like a master plan community, and say they're adjacent to Coit Road, and it's an arterial, and they're responsible for a quarter mile of Coit Road, and it's going to connect two sections that are asphalt, blacktop, or we have like an east-west arterial that they barely touch, And if we can trade their road obligation, the same cost, out of Coit and place it onto that east-west connection that's, say, a larger priority for the residents and the council and the city, and then partner with a couple of other master plan developers to do the same, we have the ability to, in a more quick, in a quicker manner, make those connections east to west or north to south, or whatever your particular city's needs are. We can help trade their infrastructure obligations in their particular area through the development agreement and place their money into these areas that are of greater, of greater need and more urgent. So that's kind of one thing we do. We just try to leverage all of our funding, all of their funding, and see if we can take all these different pots of money, put them together, and come up with something that is the best for the community at large and for everybody involved. And obviously, their project still has to pencil, and it doesn't always work out, but I think that's what we try to do, is just try to figure out how can we put everybody's resources together to come out with the best possible plan for that community or whatever that project is.
And Travis, I'll take a very brief second just to take a little different spin on value capture. I think as planners and whatnot, we spend a lot of time developing plans and doing a fiscal analysis on those plans. And I think, as Craig mentioned, thinking as a business, is if you were to give something away, make sure you're getting what you had in that plan or what you wanted to, because that plan was the value that you wanted to capture for the city. So I think as you leverage these tools, make sure that as you're going through it, that you're getting in return what you are giving them, if you will. So just a little different perspective. I think too many times, I remember one community I was talking with, is they had a really, really cool development. Everyone loved it, except you looked at the master plan, it's supposed to be a mixed use development. It was a 1-story building. But so when you look at it, the plan that they got and the value that they captured was not what they intended to at the beginning. Even though everyone loved the development, it just wasn't what their plan was. So just kind of keep that in mind.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jeff. This is important to get into the implementation, and do we have the resources to move that forward? Well, speaking of that implementation, and one theme I kind of picked up hearing from this conversation is, do these tools collectively allow your city to better address maintenance, because it's, in at least concept, freeing up the capital improvement plan and maybe bond funds for other areas? Is that something you would say is a benefit of applying these tools?
I'll chime in on the impact fee side. I can also speak a little bit on the TIF side as well. McKinney also does have our downtown TIF. And I would say yes, 100%. That was in our 2020 impact fee update. That was a huge component of discussion, was the fact that being able to maximize to a reasonable extent the amount of impact fees that we're able to charge and collect for new growth frees up the city's coffers for the maintenance needs, which are becoming great. Our El Dorado and Stonebridge developments are beautiful master plan communities here in McKinney, but they are aging, and the roadway that support those developments and existing McKinney, they're going to start aging out pretty soon, and we're going to have a lot of maintenance needs. And so being able to appropriately capture construction costs and revenues for new growth is really important. One thing that I didn't mention in my presentation, but was a huge point of discussion for us in our previous impact fee update, was actually starting to include intersection improvements in the calculation for impact fees. And that was relatively, I would say that's relatively new, and Jeff can probably speak to this a little bit more, but impact fee programs of old did not used to include that, or at least not in McKinney. But because intersection improvements add capacity to the system, we do feel like it's something that we can try and capture. And so that's been a significant change for us, because it's allowed us to use impact fees to supplement some of those intersection improvements. I would say on the TIF side, in the traditional sense of a TIF, which to me, Craig's example in North Richland Hills, is the traditional use of a TIF and a PID. You've got a master plan you've got a very specific project plan and project that you're trying to implement. And in downtown McKinney, that's exactly how we've used our TIF, and being able to reinvest those TIF dollars for infrastructure projects and redevelopment projects definitely helps to focus the dollars on maintenance and maintenance improvements. So being able to take that value capture from the TIF and use that for projects specific to that district frees up our general obligations and revenue bonds for the rest of the city, which maybe doesn't have as specialized of a need as like our downtown, or in Craig's example in North Richland Hills, that new mixed use development that is trying to get off the ground.
I'd echo Jennifer's commentary. Celina is one of our many TIF districts, is our downtown one. And that's probably the only area of Celina that's actually older than 10 years anyway. So in terms of maintenance outside of county roads. But I mean, that's exactly, it's used for reinvestment and infrastructure and maintenance type purposes in our oldest part of our community, help improve the connectivity and things of that nature.
Just to add one thing, that it wasn't my idea, but looking back, I think it was a really smart idea by the city manager when we were designing the TIF for City Point, is that in our documentation and in our legislation that we adopted for the TIF and that we communicate to the bond rating agencies, is that the City Point TIF is only drawing from the M&O and is not drawing or pulling from any INS growth. And we say that and we track that because the bond rating agencies, the S&Ps and the Moody's and whatnot, they look at that favorably. So if you consider TIFs in the future, you may want to design it in a manner where it's only on the M&O and it protects that INS and doesn't erode your bonding capacity, either from a GO or CO standpoint. And then the same thing with a PID. Again, it's designed, it's not to the full faith and credit of the city. So bond rating agencies do look favorably on that, especially when you're trying to get that high rating to get that low debt rate.
And Craig, you said something, did I hear you correctly, that as the, not the increment, but as the values in the TIF grew, the PID assessment would go down or goes down?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. With it, but the TIF was designed to term out early if the maximum was reached ahead of time in the 20-year period. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds familiar, Craig. The TIF and the PID, the value going down. Like I said, we looked at case studies around the region. I think we saw that in a couple other places. Again, where you have a new, well, I mean, the City Point is on the old mall, but essentially a new development, either vacant land or old land. And Craig, I want to follow up just very quickly. I'm not super familiar with municipal bonding. Do these value capture tools expand the city's ability to borrow, or is it taking away from the net ability of the city to borrow?
It depends on how they're designed, but impact fees, that's a revenue stream.
Right.
Yeah, it depends on how they're designed and then what's pledged. So for example, if you design a TIF, you can design a TIF to be pay as you go, or it just accumulates dollars and then you spend it as the dollars come in, or you can pledge debt, hoping that the TIF revenues come in to meet that. But what we've discussed today, if it's a revenue stream, it's usually a benefit to the bond rating agencies, and also it should not impact your bond capacity, especially like in this case, the TIF that we designed is outside of the INS component of our ad valorem tax rate.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks, Craig, for that insight there. Definitely a lot of the mechanics of implementation that are important to know. I wanted to just give you guys an opportunity. Are there any questions you want to ask each other before we move on? Or Teague's comments?
Yeah, I do have a question for Dusty. This is Craig. This was our first PID in North Richland Hills, and I am aware that Celina has numerous PIDs. What's the community reception? What's the residential lot owner reception, the developer reception of the PID districts?
That's a great question. I think, again, every city's a unique situation. I think from a Celina standpoint, 80% of Celina has moved here in the past 5 years. 90% of Celina has not yet moved here. So it's a much different situation than some of these suburban cities, bedroom communities that are already 30, 40 years built out. So, I mean, I think a lot of our residents just haven't really gotten that involved yet. And maybe in the past few years, they're waking up to the fact that they do have a tax stack in order to be in their neighborhoods. I think a lot of, especially with PIDs or even TIRZ uses, when you use them for mixed use projects or downtown projects, or like as Jennifer mentioned earlier, more traditional use of them, I think generally they should be well received. One of my previous communities was a very cautious community, Saxe, and we were able to get one established on the Turnpike. And what was used to be open fields is now mixed use development. So, I mean, I think depending upon the community, even if it's cautious or uninvolved or even bold, and I think they can always work. But as far as the reception, I mean, there's always commentary. But I think also, again, Celina's in a unique situation.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, not too long ago, there was a new state law that required word disclosure or set guidelines for disclosing PID participation. Is anyone familiar with that?
Yeah, having tried to buy a house in the place of the PID, they are supposed to disclose it. So I know it more from a personal standpoint. I was gonna say, Craig, interesting thing, I lived in downtown Fort Worth as a PID, and your question to Dusty is they went to raise the PID and they asked people to vote for it. And I think because they campaign, and I think a lot of people are willing to pay money when they know what they're getting back for it. And so it passed pretty heavily in downtown in our PID, because as a resident there and we knew what we were getting for it, and it was explained really well to us. So I think like some people are willing to pay the $100 extra or whatever if they feel like they're getting value for it.
Yeah, I would say in McKinney, we don't have a PID yet, but it is something that we anticipate is likely in the future. And the big focus from our city leadership is it kind of goes to Craig, your comment of the but for, the development may occur, but what else are we getting for that PID assessment above and beyond what would traditionally occur in a standard development? So the focus that McKinney has on the PIDs is a higher and better quality of services for things like parks, median landscaping, and roadway enhancements. So, looking at that PID for those enhancements and less on just funding development that would otherwise be required to meet those minimum thresholds anyways. So we're looking at that. What are we getting in addition to standard?
Yeah, and Craig, the last thing I would mention is that a lot of the PIDs Celina utilizes are for neighborhoods that aren't yet here. So, I mean, a lot of people buy into this. So as mentioned by Jeff, it's all disclosed, and they're also buying in. There's every market is slightly different, and the Celina market is right up the tollway from the Plano, Frisco, Prosper, now Celina market. So the expectations for the amenities and everything, the tollway corridor simply outperforms all the other corridors, in the Metroplex and even the state in terms of expectations for amenities and things of that nature. So I think also just the demographics of the residents are a different animal.
I had a PID question too. It was something I've noticed comparing PIDs, and I don't know if DFW Dusty, the ones in Celina this way. When we were looking at PIDs in Amarillo, they were all fixed costs, like $500 a month or $400 a month. But when you look at like the Viridian or even downtown where I lived, it was based on like a tax rate. I don't know if there's like a difference in DFW versus, I mean, I think you can structure them either way, but I don't know, maybe in Travis in your research, if you saw a more common fixed rate versus tax rate, basically. I was just curious on, that's like a DFW thing.
Ours are a fixed assessment prior to the development even beginning. So like the 40-foot wide lots would have X amount over 30-year amortization. 50-foot wide lights would have, 20,000 or whatever the math turns out to be, depending upon the infrastructure necessary. And then, as far as, 60, I mean, every lot size has their own different fixed assessment. And some people pay those off after 5 or 10 years. Some people want to amortize it for as long as possible. There's not a right or wrong to that. And also part of that is that, construction will never be cheaper than it is today. I mean, the time value of money, how fast do you want to activate your tax base? The longer you wait, sometimes the harder the infrastructure challenges become. And so I think from a Celina's point of view, ensuring that we can activate some of those areas earlier, because those rooftops do bring some of the Costco's and HEBs and everything else. And I think it throws a accelerant onto the situation.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, responding to your question, that's something we're going to kind of talk about in our report with the dual nature of PIDs. So the urban PIDs are, PAYGO PIDs, so we call them, because they set it at roughly 1% of your property value. And so it scales with obviously bigger property, and it tends to be sort of a smaller amount as a net amount. And so that is a percent per $100 value, or amount per $100 of assessed value. Whereas with a PID that is building capital up front and taking out a bond, or there's money being borrowed, or it's a reimbursement agreement where I guess the developer's borrowing the money and then the city's reimbursing them, that's proportional to whatever that repayment of that bond is. So it's that set amount, so they know here's what we've got to pay it off. So each year, here's a set amount versus a percentage of value. And so, yeah, that's a nice segue to, again, the report I alluded to that we're going to be sharing, that will describe that information. But I do kind of want to wrap it up here so we can kind of move on to our announcements. And thank you all for your participation. I really love that you guys focused on, as we're doing these and explain them to the public, it's about capturing that value to pay for those improvements that benefit the public, that the public is getting value out of this, whether it's transportation or something else. It's that the reason we do value capture is to return that value to public improvement and services. So that was a great theme that you guys all illustrated there. Well, as I said, we're wrapping up the conversation. So I want to thank you guys all for dedicating the time and thought to put together this presentation. I think it was a really interesting conversation, and I learned a lot on what's going on in the region and giving perspective on that. So like I said, we're going to be posting this on our website, and if you guys would be available for follow-up, if anyone wants to contact you and kind of get the details further on projects so they can possibly learn and implement in their community. Hopefully y'all would be open to that. So, all right, Jeff, you're on board. Cool. Well, thank you again, guys, and look forward to seeing you guys around the region. And we are now going to jump into a few announcements that we think our folks on the call would benefit from hearing. So, Sydney, what's our first one? Oh, hey, the first one is me. All right, so we do a lot of stuff here at the Council of Governments, including developing a regional GIS layer, mapping out the sidewalks in the greater North Texas area. Basically, it's sidewalk center lines for existing sidewalks. For some of them, we have marked crosswalks in there too. 159 jurisdictions. how do we get that number? It means cities with a population over 1,000 who are in the 12 county metropolitan planning area. And where it came from was a digitization of the 2021 aerial imagery that our Spatial Data Cooperative Program puts together. If you would like to get this layer for your city, if you're a city that needs it, some of this data came from cities that already had sidewalk data. So, but if you're a city that is looking for it, email our GIS specialist, James McLean, and you'll need to sign a quick form, but we will be happy to share that data so you can advance walkable, diverse transportation places. All right, what's our next announcement, Sydney?
I think I'll be doing this one, Travis. All right, so we just wanted to bring to your attention, some of you may already be aware, but HUD has recently established this Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Program that aims to provide local governments with technical assistance for integrating housing and some transportation planning into larger infrastructure projects specifically located maybe in a disadvantaged community. The reason we wanted to bring this to your attention is the guidance does say that MPOs can provide support. So if your community is interested in applying and you would like support from COG, please feel free to email myself, Travis, or Sean, and we can figure out how to best help you with your application. Some of the applicant information to share that I wanted to highlight, applications are now being accepted as of March, and that's on a rolling basis. No direct funding is given to local governments, it's just technical assistance. And priority is given to jurisdictions with populations of less than 250,000 people. So again, if you're interested in applying and you would like our support here at COG, please just feel free to reach out and we're happy to do that. Next, I just wanted to bring to your attention an event. Focus North Texas is a regional training and continuing education event for city-related topics. This is put on by some of our local Texas APA chapters. The event has been rescheduled from February now to May 12th at Great Wolf Lodge. So if you're interested in attending this event, please visit the website here on this slide. And now I'll pass it to Sean to talk about some federal grant opportunities.
Thank you, Sydney. We just wanted to share some exciting upcoming opportunities. All of these multimodal aspects. The Safe Streets for All opportunity is currently open. Applications are due on July 10th. The other grants that you see listed there have the dates that their NOFOs are anticipated to be released. And there's the link there at the bottom for more information, and putting that in the chat as well if you would like to take a look at some of those opportunities that are coming up. Go ahead to the next slide.
And Sean, on the Safe Streets for All grant, I did want to mention we had talked to the DOT and there's tons of planning money available. So if you are interested in advancing safety for pedestrians or others or everyone on the street, you might want to take a look at that, because I think the DOT has more money than they had applications last go round. And if you guys want to chat with us about that, feel free to reach out. Just a plug for that opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for that, Travis, pointing that out, because the planning funds are hard to come by. So see these opportunities when they come. We are also wanting to announce that sustainable development is hiring. We have 4 exciting positions open. We have 3 bike ped positions. We also have a position related to parking and transit-oriented development. Travis. So I am going to put these positions links in the chat for you as well. We hope that you will share these people who may be interested. And these are all hybrid positions. So part of the time in the office, part of the time working from home. So we hope that you will share those. All right, so again, please take a second to respond to our very quick 2-question survey regarding CM credits and our meeting format. If we want to do hybrid or stick with the all virtual meeting format, we'd love to hear from you about those items. As always, we'll have the meeting recording and slides you'll be able to access on our website. And I think that is all we have for today.
Thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate it. Great conversation. Look forward to seeing you all around the region. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.